Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the final part of the Eyes of the Spore Companion Podcast titled Above Us Only Sky, a reference to the John Lennon song Imagine. We left off on Chapter 14 and are now moving on to Chapter 15 titled Awoken, which will lead us to the end of the novel, which is Chapter 21. This episode will truly tie in the odyssey of John Vurduct's life, the Abrahamic call to adventure, and the true union synchronicity of this story. If you haven't watched episode 1, 2, or 3, you can go back on my YouTube channel at youtube.com/@Kyle Johannesson. Without further ado, let's get into it. So now we transition into chapter 15, which is titled A Hidden Gem. And for clarification purposes, and for anyone who's criticized me beyond this point, for clarification purposes, gem is not misspelled. This was something that was brought up by multiple people at different times, and, they're like, oh, Kyle, you misspelled gem, oh, it's horrible, whatever. But it's spelt in this way because it's a reference to Jem Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird, and that's the transitionary play that I go to in that reference. So again, Jem is not misspelt. It is related to Jem Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird, which is one of my favorite novels. So anyways, in chapter 15, John wakes up to Anne cutting vegetables on the countertop. Wakes up from the cabin, and they talk about the different scenes that happened the day before, and John's a little bit confused. And John says he talked to Grace, and Anne tells John to be careful with her and tells him that Grace might not be a true believer, even though John himself isn't really a believer in the cult. And John is very displeased by the way Anne and Robert talk about Grace, and this is the first sign of them being ingenuine to their religion, where, Benjamin says, accept everyone and treat everyone equally. But John ignores it, and they go to Benjamin's morning sermon yet again. So in the sermon, Benjamin tells everyone this time to exchange prized possessions, in short, with someone that they don't know. And John doesn't really have any prized possessions besides his satchel, which is in Benjamin's possession. So John follows Grace and says, hey, let's exchange. So they go to her cabin, and they basically have just disregarded the sermon and Benjamin's advice. John returns to the cabin and sees a sketch of a river, and John tells her that it's almost like the one he sees in that recurring dream. And again, that's union synchronicity poking its head out again. Basically, John, from chapter 1 to chapter 15 so far, this reoccurring river dream, and for Grace to paint or draw something that's that close to what he dreams is union synchronicity. And you can conclude what that means. But John and Grace essentially after that spend the day together, and he begins to learn more about the scope of the cult he's in. And Grace tells him that some people actually think that he's the one that's going to lead him to paradise as part of this religion, but that really doesn't go anywhere. John basically disregards it. So as the night begins to get darker, Grace leads John into her cabin. He's being very reluctant around being close to the same bed as her, but that quickly dissipates as Grace pulls John onto the bed, and they settle with each other. And there's this dialogue scene where John and Grace talk about where they would be if they weren't in Utah. Grace says she wants to go into the Midwest or even Europe, which is a tell sign that Grace isn't really committed to the religion about staying here in Utah and everything. So John talks about his internal struggle, if he should go to California or back to independence, and Grace tells John, whatever you're looking for, I hope you find it, even if it is this moment right here next to me, which reveals the feelings flow both ways without explicitly revealing that in a candid way. Then John says, screw it. He shoots a shot and tells Grace that he loves her, and it gets this very intense and emotional. And notice how all the anxiety is different compared to when Victoria and John had a similar interaction. And it really shows that John's grown a lot, and he's become a lot more confident. And one can conclude that if it wasn't for all the stuff John had went through, this situation would have acted out differently in John's perspective than it did. One could speculate that John's anxiety and this inner intensity that he has is gone away. If John met Grace before he went off on this path, California, Probably would have took them months to get there, but it's essentially the second or third day they meet each other. John just says, okay, let's see how this ends off. And there's a bit of a tense moment between them, but it is just take a little bit of a note how far John's character has evolved. And that is the end of chapter 15. So now we go to chapter 16, which is Awoken. And this chapter is the start of the third transitionary period in the book, hence the title name Awoken. And I know I talk a lot about, I pretty much said every chapter is a transitionary, but this is the third transitionary period when the book starts to drive up intensity yet again. So the chapter starts with John and Grace waking up together, and John's anxiety, as I previously stated, seems to have drifted away, and his tonality in the way he reflects and expresses things, you could see in the writings that I wrote that John has transitioned a little bit. He's more poetic, he's more calm when it comes to the way he writes things, and that's basically his mentality changing. That's him growing up and kind of coming of age. So they both wake up, and Grace and John rush to the morning prayer session because it's getting a little late, and eyes slowly start to pan on both of them, including Robert and Anne, who are quite suspicious of what events took place the night before. However, there is minimal confrontation at the moment, and Benjamin's morning sermon begins. So Benjamin orders his followers to go to the lake and make a circle, kind of like what happened when John first got there. He tells everyone that he'll be telling everyone about entering the gates of paradise, and they go into this river and stuff, and Benjamin ends up saying, okay, we're gonna send people to paradise today. And by surprise, Benjamin ends up drowning Robert and pushing him down to the lake as people cheer, and including Anne, who's cheers the loudest. And this is almost like the Lord of the Flies, if you know that specific scene I'm referencing to. But this is where John realizes that this is paradise for you guys, and it's just too much for John. And John goes back to the cabin, and Anne enters behind him, and they have this really creepy interaction where Anne is convinced that Robert truly is believed that her husband went to paradise, even with Anne saying, I thought you were going to be welcome to paradise yourself, while she's just casually cutting up a beet vegetable in the cabin, which is a little bit strange for John to hear. And now John's starting to realize that the cult is not a tame one. Now he begins to plot his escape. And although he just wants to run into the woods like most people probably would have done at this point, he knows that it is more important to get Grace out of the cult than his personal safety. So John runs to Grace's cabin and attempts to plot a plan to leave. And Grace is about 15% sure at this point that Benjamin still is the prophet, but she wants to see confirmation, and seeing Benjamin's journal for that confirmation, which is also coincidentally where John's satchel is. So the chapter, along with the night scene in the book, becomes more poetic. John's love for Grace essentially transforms from a linear process like what John originally had for Victoria into this like symphonic movement. And John's writing becomes more poetic, even more than before, as his love turns John's feeling as to, look, there's a potential partner. Now it becomes more of a passion. And I have words like unorganized agency, and it's now starting to mold John's new perspective. So John wakes up the next morning and opens the door and sees that the morning sun rays are getting a little bit later and the wind's getting colder. And although he doesn't have any sort of calendar, or they don't have a watch, he knows that the winter is approaching very soon. And if he wants to escape this cult, it has to be very soon, because as I previously stated, traveling west or east in long droves in the winter is just impossible, and he knows he has to escape it very soon. And this is another turning point of the novel, where the call to adventure calls John back to independence, knowing that he found Grace. John, at this point, California is simply just a memory, and he says, okay, I found who I need to find, and now this is that call to adventure calling him back, because sometimes that happens in life. Sometimes that call to adventure in life may send you another way and says, okay, you got what you needed to get. Now it's time to come back and finish what you have intended. And so as they kind of continue to talk, Grace presents John with an idea to escape. They'll both sneak into Benjamin's cabin, and she'll get to see that journal, get rid of that 15% belief, and he'll grab his satchel, and she paces back and forth when she's telling him her plan. And it kind of reminds John that they're really strangely alike, and pacing was something that John consistently did when he was still in the tailor shop, kind of thinking about Victoria. But John writes, I not only fell in love with her courage, but I also felt a deep captivation by her ability to pour passion into the uncertain future, which ties into their escape back to independence. And John leaves Grace's cabin and reflects on the lake as he walks back, and then he's confronted by Benjamin, who questions him about the absence of his attendance at the last morning sermon, which John and Grace missed, which I didn't mention in this podcast, but I mentioned it in the book. So Benjamin creeps up on John and says, well, why don't you come visit me in the cabin? And Benjamin leads John to this brightly candlelit cavern and says, well, let's have some tea and talk about this. And John has this creepy conversation with John, essentially telling him not to step out of line and to not disturb his religious group. Don't do anything stupid. And drinking the tea, and then the tea starts to make him hallucinate and see his childhood in 3 stages. One of him helping his father build a porch, finishing the porch, and then finally that last scene where John sees his father once again on the floor dead of a heart attack, except this time with Benjamin's notebook in his hand. And Benjamin keeps telling John in this like trance-like state where Benjamin has obviously drugged John, basically keeps telling him that he is supposed to be where he is, and tells him to not keep insisting that he's far from where he's supposed to be. And that is the very weird ending of chapter 16. So now we move on to chapter 17, which is titled Displaced Approximately, which is a little bit of the play, as I previously referenced to a Bob Dylan song, which is Queen Jane Approximately. So give that song a lesson. We can make a whole damn playlist out of all of my chapter titles. I think I just came up with a pretty good idea. So chapter 17, in my opinion, and again, I'm just the writer, the readers, I believe, are more important when it comes to opinions, but I think this is the most important chapter of the book. It's the most transformative, and it really lays down everything from here on out. So we ended in chapter 16 where Benjamin, gives John this psychedelic tea, and he goes through this long trance, and at the end Benjamin says, this is where you are supposed to be. This is not a mistake. And I tried to tie into a bigger issue here is some people live in hell, and sometimes people are in some very terrible situations, and oftentimes either say or just think that they think they're not where they're supposed to be. And Benjamin, in a very creepy but subtle way, reminds John that he is where he is supposed to be. So again, something just interesting to take note of. And that's even why I titled it Displaced Approximately. So continuing on with chapter 17, John dries up on the shore, which is pretty much pressing the metaphorical reset button. And he wakes up, his back is on the jagged rocks, just as when he got there. And he's now reminded again that the winter is coming, and that call to adventure is pulling him back. He describes the sun rising a little bit later than usual, and that cold breeze is starting to come, and especially in Utah, which the climate's a little bit different than Independence, Missouri, but he knows that the winter's coming, and he knows he has to leave soon, because if not, he's going to be stuck, and from what he's thinking at this point, probably that he won't survive. John kind of describes the tea when he's reflecting upon the shore. He describes as gypsy magic or voodoo hypnoticism, alluding to kind of John's agnostic sort of view on this whole cult thing. John really doesn't describe, and I really didn't write John's character as someone who's overly religious, just to the point where John has such an open mind, not to the extent where his head, his brain falls out, but John has a very open mind. And again, I did not want to tie this cult or this religious organization into anything that's real. Again, the religious group, the Benjamin is entirely a fictitious character, doesn't have to do anything with the Mormons and all that. So John and Grace unite the next morning when John recalls his tea experience, and they realize that they're missing Benjamin's sermon, and it's probably not a good idea to miss it, so they go to his morning sermon. So That morning, John and Grace arrive and they notice 12 people are missing from these benches. And everyone applauds as Benjamin tells them that these 12 people have entered paradise. And John's a little freaked out because he knows that they've entered paradise, meaning they went where Robert went. And then Benjamin instructs John to follow him to the lake to join the group for this entry to paradise. And John understands that his demise might be likely. And John trembles in fear, and Benjamin pushes him in the water. The paradise entry is starting to begin in those words, and Grace starts to realize that John is drowning. She pulls Benjamin, and Grace is then taken by two women. John's life is spared, and I kind of created this whole scene. Again, I explain it much better in the book. You have to read the book to get that. I'm just summarizing it. But I made it specifically to where Benjamin was quote-unquote drowning John. I made it specifically unclear if Benjamin actually had the intention to drown him or just get him kind of to the edge of death as he did, because I feel like Benjamin probably would have followed through with this, even if Grace just pulled on his shoulders, whatever. So again, John's life is spared, and John coughs up water for the next 2 hours, and he's very frightened and a bit startled. And then all of a sudden, Benjamin wraps his arms around him and talks to him, and John realizes now more than ever that his escape will not be a formality, rather a strive into the unknown. And Benjamin talks to John and treats him in a respectful manner, as he believes John will stay with the group, even going forward to tell him that he sent Anne to paradise, Robert's wife, so that he could have the whole cabin to himself, have Robert and Anne's cabin to himself, and does not have to be with Grace, which I think is one of the most creepy lines I wrote in that, to where Benjamin says, oh, by the way, I sent Robert and Anne both to paradise just so you could have your own cabin. It just shows that Benjamin knows that he is making it up just to kind of convenience John. And the intentions for Benjamin's treatment of John so well and trying to get him in is just very unclear. A lot of people said to me, well, if Benjamin will just send him to paradise and kill him, then why does it matter? So that's something you just have to think about. You could go down a rabbit hole, but it really wasn't, anything like that wasn't really explicitly stated. John says, okay, so he goes to Robert and Anne's cabin, and he's just nauseated by the silence of the cabin. And he's looking in the kitchen area and sees freshly cut up beets from the morning of, which he suspects that Anne's paradise departure was unexpected. And John starts to now develop some sort of PTSD. He struggled with his anxiety the whole way from chapter 1 to 16, and now he's starting to get PTSD. So this kid doesn't really catch a break. After that, John develops many different scenarios on how to leave the cult, and he's very unsuccessful with the plan. He doesn't know exactly what to do. He knows that Grace is very important to him. He knows the satchel's very important to him in terms of getting out successfully, but he doesn't have that plan of how to really escape. So after that, John goes to Grace's cabin and notices a piece of wood blocking the door, and he simply moves it out of the way, and John and Grace unite, and Grace tells John that after she pulled Benjamin away after he was drowning John, two women took her and locked her in her cabin, and Grace tells John that she was threatened to be cleansed, which is a new term if she doesn't stay in her cabin. And Grace and John both realize at this point that this will either be their last night in Utah, or this would be their last night indefinitely. And this is where things start to tense up a little bit. And Grace and John now understand that they have to break into Benjamin's cabin in order to move forward with this plan to get out of there. They don't have a plan yet, but they know that they need to get the satchel, and Grace needs to see the notebook, even though at this point she's pretty damn convinced that it's a cult. So they go into Benjamin's cabin, and no one's there, and Grace lights a new candle that's sitting on the desk. Take note of that. And John retrieves his satchel. Grace looks in Benjamin's notebook and realizes that there are phase notes, and he had plans to get rid of Anne and Robert, and the third phase was them. And Grace gets all scared and becomes 100% disinterested in the notebook, pretty much tosses it, and realizing now that 100% she's in a cult. Grace and John leave Benjamin's cabin and return to Grace's cabin, and John shows that Grace all the money from the satchel and all the essentials that needs to go away. And then part of this union synchronicity, which I think I wrote beautifully, but we'll have to hear from the listeners. But there's a scene where John reaches all the way down into his satchel and pulls out the green emerald and gold band engagement ring, which was placed there when Victoria rejected him, and symbolizing at this point John's rekindling of passion for someone, and this would be Grace. And almost in a Romeo and Juliet style, within a couple days, John proposed to Grace and tells her that he's going to take her back to independence, and that call to adventure is calling him back. And Grace accepts beautifully, great scene, and John says, you know what, let's run away tonight. And Grace insists that they won't be able to do it, and tells him that they have to complete a 7-mile walk, which is a little bit of a reference to Luke 24:13, to a smaller town to, connect them out of there. So there's a 7-mile hike out of where that is in Utah to the town over, and they can't do it at night. They have to do it in the morning. So John reluctantly agrees, and they agree that they'll leave after Benjamin's morning sermon. And John take note of the word places the wood on Grace's door and says, okay, I'm going to leave it. I was never here. John goes back to his cabin, which was formerly Robert and Anne's cabin, which really is not that important by this point. And John recalls this as the longest night. And once the morning sermon is on the horizon, he goes with a newfound confidence that this will be his last. And Benjamin orders 2 of the strongest men in the scene when John goes to the morning sermon, orders 2 of the strongest men to sit closely next to John. And now things start to get all weird. So John checks around for Grace, but it's clear that Grace is still in the cabin, and I guess she hasn't been forgiven by the 2 women or Benjamin, or however you want to conspiratize this. So Benjamin starts a very angry sermon, a little bit angrier than usual, and starts talking about betrayal. And then, if you really couldn't solve the crime scene enough, he holds up the half-burnt candle that he found in the cabin and accuses John of doing it, and Grace as his sidekick. And that was almost their Achilles heel of breaking into the cabin. That one candle that Grace lit as light, which is another form of symbolism to go and get everything. And now John's whole world crumbles under him, and John knows that he's in deep. So then the scene continues where Benjamin's accusing him. The 2 men are grabbing John at this point. And then John pans his head and he realizes that the cabin is on fire. Grace's cabin is on fire. And a plume of smoke grows. And John realizes that he placed that stupid piece of wood and trapped Grace. And now this is really where the whole world crumbles in on him, because he realizes that Benjamin set pretty much Grace alive in the cabin, and this is where John's heart drops and all of his hope just completely shatters. So now John's pulled by the 2 men in front of the benches, where Benjamin pulls out a knife and presses it to his neck. And then all of a sudden, unexpectedly, Grace slams Benjamin over his head with the piece of wood that was in front of the cabin. And Grace runs into the woods after doing that, and everyone surrounds Benjamin. They don't know what's going on, and no one's paying attention to John, and he runs into the woods with Grace. And that piece of wood that Grace slapped or smacked, whatever you want to say, Benjamin's head was the piece of wood that was in front of the door. And now you ask, the big question I got is, well, this really doesn't make sense because John placed it, whatever. John placed it. Remember, John has no idea what he's doing. He knows how to tailor a suit, whatever, but when it comes to putting a piece of wood by a door, even, he's just not technically there. And because of his screw-up, saved Grace, if you didn't catch that. So they both run into the woods after that, and they just keep running. It's basically the same scene where John's running away from the bandits as they're shooting at him, and they just shot his horse. So in this time, both John and Grace are just running far into the woods, and they run far enough into the tall grass, and they both jump on each other, and they're far enough to know that they are finally free. And that is the end of chapter 17, which I considered the most important chapter in the book. So now we move on to chapter 18, which is Lost Years of American Dreams. And this chapter title, again, is in reference to a certain song from the 60s, This is in reference to Buffalo Springfield's song Broken Arrow, where it's 18 years of American dreams. Wouldn't really make sense in this context, so I call it Lost Years of American Dreams, symbolizing all the time Grace in her youth has missed out on by being in this cult, and this purgatory-esque time that John has been in the tailor shop and had to go all the way out to Utah. This is the lost years of American dreams. Both John and Grace really lost the prime years of their life, so that's why I titled it among the reference to the song. So they're both laying in the field, and then all of a sudden rain starts to pour on them as they lay in the grass, and it kind of symbolizes relief as they're both laying in the grass. And the rain also symbolizes rare divine intervention, as Utah is really not known for rain, especially during that season. And I had to look that up. I had to do a little meteorology research for that. So they keep going. Grace and John hike to the one-horse town of Bloomington, and they convince a hay transporter to get them to Fort Bridger for the cost of $30, which is probably about, I did the math, about $1,400 in today's money, so that's pretty generous pay. The hay transporter is pretty reluctant, but he says, okay, I'll get you to Fort Bridger, whatever. So they travel for a few days, and we notice that Grace kind of becomes quiet, but she keeps a hard squeeze on John's hand, revealing that she still loves John passionately more than ever, but is just totally riddled with anxiety. And even though John's anxiety is gone, Grace's anxiety just built up 500 times. So they arrive at the fort, and John sees all the empty souls again who are traveling to and from California. And this time, John doesn't compare himself to them like he once did. You know, John previously, in a couple chapters before, treated Fort Bridger as like this plague. And he says, well, maybe I'm like that, maybe I'm not. This time, he doesn't say anything. He says, I have my task. I got the gold, which was Grace. And now they're returning home. So they arrive at the fort, and writing about Fort Bridger was a strategic ploy to show the readers how far John has become during this metaphorical loop. And it's to kind of mark how much John has grown in such a little time, which was pretty much just a merely few months from when he left Independence to coming back now. So now, towards the end, when they're dropped off in Fort Bridger, John and Grace are presented with Jeb, who's a 15-year-old transporter who agrees to take them all the way back to Independence. And there is no other transporters. John doesn't want to take a horse again and ride with Grace on one horse. They want a transporter. John's skeptical about him, but he realizes that Jeb, at this time, as the winter's approaching, Jeb's their only choice. So John and Grace travel back. It just shows that it's a long sigh of relief for Grace, and John is happy, relieved, and mostly exhausted after taking a full loop back. So they finally arrive in Independence, and John pays Jeb, and two lost lovers go back to where one of them had once called home. And that is the end of Chapter 18, which is a very quick one. So now we transition into Chapter 19, which is titled Frostbitten Slumbers, which is a reference to the Beatles' Abbey Road album, and a song on there is Golden Slumbers. This is Frostbitten Slumbers. One, because it partakes on December 25th, and it's Christmas time, and John and Grace are dropped off by Jeb, and they walk through the town, and John realizes that a lot of the buildings have gone abandoned. And it's almost like a Sodom and Gomorrah-esque site, to where he's walking around the town and just sees like all these different buildings becoming abandoned. It's a little bit stranger than prior to him leaving. And says, okay, let's see what the old tailor shop is doing. So John enters his old tailor shop, and he finds a key hidden under one of the floorboards. And he sees that no one's entered it for quite some time. And he might even think that he might have been the last person to enter it before he left Independence those couple months ago. So he enters it. A lot of questions still flowing through his head. Grace goes to the second floor and lays on that bed that John had, and John looks at her and realizes that she's in the same spot that John used to lay, and think about what his life would become. And this is my favorite term, actually, which is union synchronicity, appearing once again as he sees the sight of Grace kind of laying there and realizes that he spent all of this time, he went through hell and back, literally, and now he sees that Grace and John, looking at himself in a third-person perspective, are both where they are leading up to where they're supposed to be. So it's cold in Independence. John warms up the stove for Grace as she sleeps, and as she takes her nap, John explores the town and looks across the street and sees Sam's shop boarded up for good. And he's trying to put the puzzle together, trying to see what happened. This town of Independence, it wasn't thriving per se when he left, but now it's just gone bearish. So what better place to go for information? So John returns to Independence Tavern and sees it really hasn't changed. And John talks to the unshaven and more fragile Thomas. So Thomas and John catch up, and Thomas tells John that massive rain and floods killed the right bank. And this is actually written true. So during that time in Independence, Missouri, there were massive flooding, which caused a lot of damage to Independence. So that's kind of realism. Again, a lot of meteorology work was done. A lot of historic background was done. So I tied that in. So basically, Thomas tells John that there was massive rain and floods killed the Wright bank, and Mr. Wright ended up having a heart attack, and the Wright family and the Lynch family had a fight, and everything was just broken up, just destroyed. And Thomas tells John that pretty much his shop is fair game, and the Wrights don't own anything anymore. All the assets were splitting up, and he could pretty much have his tailor shop back. The lease has been forgiven. And he also says that John's childhood home, which was recently abandoned by Sylvia, he says that's up for fair game too, if he wants to come back. So John takes a salted fish back to Grace, which he ends up cooking for her. This is probably the first real solid meal that they had during this whole trip. And try to figure out the symbolism of the salted fish. It's not like the ham where I literally just wrote it because I needed food to put into it, but kind of figure out what the salted fish means. So after they have the fish, John and Grace lay together, and John points at his childhood home. He points through, points out of the window and says, I want to show you that house over there. Grace still eating the fish and a little bit distracted. Grace becomes familiarized now specifically with John's previous shop and his life, showing her around the tailor shop, and this is where he used to sleep, whatever. And John says to Grace, this second floor up here, this could be her art studio. And this is where they could even have art exhibits at the main floor of the shop. John's kind of teasing. He's got this charisma into him. He's teasing Grace. You could have your art studio, and I can run the tailor shop, and we could have this dual dynamic. And then Grace says, where would they sleep then? This is John's bedroom, whatever. And John says, all right, well, let's go see that house I pointed to you. And Grace gets excited, and John, he has this kind of inner romance, and John carries her up to his abandoned childhood home and uncovers her eyes, and she's just overwhelmed by the house in a good way. And Grace says, oh, wow, this is great. Goes into the house, and John's haunted past suddenly disappears as Grace casts a new light on the house and his childhood overall. Even not thinking about Sylvia. He really doesn't even mention Sylvia too much after this. And John looks at the porch, and him connecting to where Benjamin's psychedelic tea experience, looks at the porch in a different light that he saw it in that experience. But this is the point where John's haunted childhood past disappears. And this is where everything is painted over, metaphorically. Everything's painted over, and, the world's promises will soon become new. Now Grace runs to the house and finds a bottle of wine and 2 glasses, ironically. This is that tying into the alcohol. And Grace at the end of the chapter says, it's okay now. It's all going to be okay. This technically is the unofficial part of the book that ends. It's almost like Red Dead Redemption 2 when Arthur dies. Sorry for the spoiler, but I do have to write the next 2 chapters. There's chapter 20 and there's chapter 21 to kind of really connect everything together. So that was the unofficial end, where John's sitting there and he's back in his childhood home. He's with the love of his life, and she just looks at him and says, it's going to be okay in the end. It's all okay. And that's John's closure. So that is the end of chapter 19, and now we transition to chapter 20. So now we move on to chapter 20, which is Misty Roses. This is the beginning of the epilogue chapters, the 2 chapters I mentioned that cap up everything. The chapter title is in reference to Colin Blunstone's single song, Misty Roses, which is a good song. Again, add it to that Eyes of a Spore playlist. I guess I'm going to have to make that now. So chapter 20 takes place 2 years to May of 1853. Independence has returned back to life, and it seems the world has kind of been renewed. It's back in May. The roses are blooming. The flowers are doing good. John is back to where he sees that his life and the town around him is blossoming. So John says that Grace painted the entire house white, symbolizing it as a blank canvas for endless possibilities. That's kind of Grace's art background and her own personal symbolism now entering John's life. And for Grace to recognize that John's childhood home was a bit traumatic for him, not in an abusive way or anything, it was just very dull. Grace comes in and paints the whole house white, which is my favorite symbolic interactions in this book. So then we learn that the tailor shop is in the best condition it's ever been, and the floors are once again polished. And John still thinks about the cult, and he sees that Grace has nightmares when she sleeps during some nights. However, he lives knowing that his story was one where he rescued someone as mere fate rather than worrying about what would have happened if he didn't make it out alive. So again, he takes Benjamin's words a little bit to where he says, this is where you're supposed to be. And he ties that into the greater port of his life in a more beautiful way. He doesn't worry what would have happened if he didn't make it out alive. John says, this is where I'm supposed to be. And this is how the story continues. And then I had to connect someone else because we all missed her. So one day John is alone in the tailor shop, and Victoria comes in to see him. And John hasn't seen him for years. And she's frail and not entirely what John had remembered. And Victoria tells John that she comes in, she says, that letter that you sent before you left, she thinks about it and reads it frequently, and she just wants to rekindle their lost love. And John tells Victoria that he chased her love far too soon, and she chased his love far too late. And that's the kind of sad ending of Victoria, and basically says she comes and she's all frail and whatever. And as I wrote Victoria's final scene, I didn't explicitly say that she became frail, that she just was frail, and she just didn't look like what John originally saw. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that was written due to the fact that John just no longer sees Victoria in this romantic light, in this jaded perspective that he once had, and just sees her for her face value, which was just nothing merely compared to Grace. Again, a scene I had to say what happens to Victoria, and that's what happens. She comes back and she says, I read that letter and I'm sorry, and her whole world fell apart. And instead of John saying, oh, well, that sucks, you screwed me over, because John knows that Victoria never really screwed him over. It was just something that happened. John didn't get the right message. Victoria ran off, whatever. And I end it by saying Victoria ran off out of my shop somewhere in another time, metaphorically saying that now she's running into her past. And I also write, alone she was, destined for a future that unknowingly passed her very eyes. It not only means that Victoria is having some experience, but John subsequently also restating that a cross-reference of what John felt when Victoria got married. If you could kind of wrap your head around that, I know that's kind of hard to understand. So after that interaction, John goes home to Grace and looks at her distinct smile and realizes that although he thinks his whole journey was not carved out for him like his entire previous life, he realizes that there was a plan in place all along from a higher power. At that point, that's John's connection and beginning relationship with God, his higher power. So after dinner, Grace and John walk around Independence, kind of wondering what they will become in their future, whether they're having kids or whether John's going to become the mayor, which John has no interest in. They walk around, and then as it starts to get dark, John and Grace go up to the highest point in Independence, which is one of many, and they go and paint the night sky. And although Grace is the best artist, clearly, by far, John doesn't know how to pick up a paintbrush. John just looks at her the whole time, knowing metaphorically she's just the brightest star, and his canvas remains dry in that scene. So Grace says, after they're done painting, Grace encourages John to return to the tavern and be with his friends and kind of enjoy the rest of the night. So over the past couple of years, John has become quite popular in the tavern, and everyone tries to buy him a drink, and he sits down, and John runs into George again. And Thomas joins in on the conversation. They recollect everything that's happened to when John left and talks about the Great Flooding and Independence, which divided the Wrights and the Lynches. And George says Mr. Wright died of a heart attack, and Victoria, along with her brothers, are simply just burning away that remaining inheritance fortune. And George tells John that Victoria is unhealthily obsessed with the past, and specifically John. And she asks about him all the time and asks George, and wanders around the hall of the mansion just trying to figure out how to rekindle their own love and how Victoria could kind of just go to her past. Again, a very, very sad ending to Victoria, but something that happened with fate. So John ends the night, and Thomas finally compliments John, telling him that his whole life finally fell into place. And this ends with John telling Thomas that we both did well. We did really good. And John goes back to his home and sleeps next to Grace. And that is the end of chapter 20. So now we go to the final chapter, the very short, almost 2-page chapter. I'm not going to open the book to confirm that, but chapter 21, which is the Marigold Morning, is in reference to one of my favorite flowers. So there you go. You get a little factoid from the author. So John wakes up the next morning after going to the tavern, and he walks to the backyard, opens his eyes, and sees Grace painting in the river in the backyard. And he goes out, and Grace tells John to stand in the river, put his feet in, and stand so she has a subject to paint. So as John stands in the river, he realizes that the body of water he once dreamt about, that reoccurring dream, was the exact river that was in his childhood backyard this entire time. And John finally says he found himself where he is supposed to be. And that is the end of the chapter and the end of the book, Eyes of the Spore. So this, ladies and gentlemen, was a tale of the call to adventure. And a lot of people ask me, they say, wow, this was a great love story. And the book is not classified as a romance novel. It is more of the experience, the call to order, the divine. It's an epic. I really, I may have put in the Barnes & Noble section that this book is a historic fiction novel, which it is a fiction novel. I can give you that much. But, I think that although, characters like Victoria and Grace and this kind of romantic thing that kind of pushed John to where he was supposed to be, they were merely characters out there that showed John the way towards progress. And this doesn't discredit Grace. This doesn't discredit Victoria for their roles, but you need to understand that this book was not about John's passion for love. It was the passion to his call to higher order, whether he called it or it called him.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I think we're going to have to go face to face for this last part, and what better scenery than to do it out in the woods? So, something that I want to leave everyone with for this companion podcast, and something that I am asked most when I give out novels or people come back to me with very extensive questions. The one main overarching question I get from most people is, what is the meaning behind Eyes of a Spore? What's that life lesson? What's that hidden meaning? And there are a lot of great literary works like The Great Gatsby, To Kill a Mockingbird. You have all these great works that have this somewhat overarching life lesson. They have something that calls to the reader and says, go out and do this, or don't forget this, or do this. In The Eyes of a Spore, I never had the intention of writing the novel with an intended life lesson. This was not the story of John Vurduct. He goes out on this adventure in order to achieve something. I didn't write it that way. But after extensively rereading and re-researching this novel, really breaking down into the semiotics of this novel, I came up with two really important ideas that I wanted to end you guys with. And one is that call to adventure. I think everyone in their life, at least once, is going to have that aspect of the call to adventure. It's going to be an opportunity that is going to completely transform your life, whether how big or how small that transformation is. And I think it takes someone with the right character and the true charisma in order to go out to that call to adventure. And also, I think it is to remind yourself that there's more into life than that day-to-day mundaneness. And I reference back to John Vurduct, where he's in the tailor shop day to day, working, going to bed, going to the tavern, coming back every single day. And John Vurduct, if he didn't reach out and he didn't liquidate his tailor shop and he never got into relations with Victoria, I think he would have been okay. He would have lived a mundane life, and he probably, like most people, would be okay in the end. But I think it takes that true character, it takes that true person who you'll see 1 out of a million, who is willing to sacrifice everything in order for the prospect of the unknown, whether it calls you or you call it. So ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate you listening to the Eyes of a Spore Companion podcast and reading this novel. And I'd just like to say, I'd like to end on this is do not get too comfortable, because the best is yet to come. Thank you.